thanks everyone for joining. Martin Gansten has joined me again to talk about his new book on annual predictive techniques, which is published by the Wessex Astrologer in the UK. Thanks, Martin, for joining, and thanks for composing a scholarly and also a reasonably practical book. So not reasonably, but entirely practical. So one part is completely practical. So thanks very much for taking time from your academic work to do this for regular astrologers, which will really help them in practice, because I think it's time to share the screen and show a little bit about the book and where it is available and so on. So I think the book is available on Amazon, and anyone can purchase the book through Amazon. So and I think we also have this look inside option here, so you can just go inside and read a little bit of introduction and whatever is there that is available to read. So
I should say that the real paper version of the book is much nicer in design than this ebook.
Yeah, it looks a bit. It looks good, but it looks a bit more busier than the paperback. So,
yeah.
But still, it's a as Amazon is very easy for everyone to get. So you can just choose Amazon to purchase the book, or if you can also get to Wessex Astrologer website. I don't know where it is. I may have just closed the link, but
yeah, I think the publisher anyway prefers not to have to try to send books, especially internationally in these COVID times. So
sure.
I think buying it through an online bookseller is probably a good idea in your own country.
Yeah, sure. If you're in UK, probably you can order through Wessex Astrologer, and this is the Wessex Astrologer website, and you can just order through it. And I think let's just talk about the cover of the book initially, to just to give a little bit of idea of how you framed. I know a traditional publisher published this book, but I'm sure you had your say on this. So if you can take through the cover, I think it will be an interesting story to deal with.
Indeed, I did suggest the image for the cover. So this is one part. Well, the uppermost part here is from an old star map, actually, but that's more for decorative purposes. The main part of the cover is this detail of an astrolabe. This is the reti, or the movable part of an astrolabe, and the astrolabe is an astronomical instrument that was developed in antiquity and then further refined in the Middle Ages, and it was in much use until early modern times, and it was used for navigation and things like that, but it was also used very much in astrology. So it was used for casting the chart, for finding the ascendant and the houses, and also it was used for primary directions, which is a technique that is very relevant for traditional annual predictions, and plays a major part in this book. Also, it has a sort of a symbolic value in that this particular astrolabe that we see here, or that we see a part of here, is actually an Indian astrolabe, or Perso-Indian. It was manufactured in well, in what is now actually Pakistan, but it was, of course, Pakistan didn't exist at the time. This was in the, I think, 17th century. So the Astrolabe entered India with Arabic language astrology and astronomy, and it was in the early Tajika texts. You can actually see it called Sturlaba, which is a sort of slightly botched version of Astrolabe, which originally is Greek. So it's a Greek word that entered Arabic, and then it entered Indian languages through Arabic. But the first person to write a work on the Astrolabe in Sanskrit was actually a Jain monk, Mahendra Suri, who wrote in the 14th century, I think, wrote a work on this instrument. And he didn't call it Sturlaba, he called it Yantra Raja.
Oh, yeah.
It means the king of instruments. And that is truly what it is to an astronomer and astrologer. So the same sort of instrument was used, by Greek astrologers, by Arabic astrologers, by Indian astrologers, and by European astrologers. And it shows how these different traditions of astrology are actually interconnected, which is a main point that I want to make in the book.
That's great. So the projection of the amalgamation of various traditions is depicted. So I think a lot of thought has gone into the cover. So
Yes.
of late, I've been very interested in the aesthetics parts of the book. So and if you want to know more about the book, you can just visit martingansten.com. It's not very difficult to remember, and you'll find two portions in the website, which is one is dedicated to astrology and the other is dedicated to academic sides of Martin. So this is what I'm talking about. So if you want to talk about astrology, you have to enter here. So this is a little bit of tutorial. And there is also an excerpt that Martin has posted in his website. So anyone who is interested to read this already available, publicly available portion of the book, I think you can just go ahead and read it. But I think as far as I see, if you're a practical astrologer, I think I'll surely recommend getting this book. Peter Stockinger of starsandstones.com has already published a review of the book, which is very good as well. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to share the screen and show. So we'll get back to this later. And to talk about a little bit of technical aesthetics, I think the book is very well designed and printed, so it's not very difficult to read the book. The font is also pleasing, and I think a lot of your thoughts have gone into it, and the gutter space is a bit more than what it is usual, which makes it easier to read the book even in the middle of the book. And it's not a very huge book. It's around 250 pages or something, so it doesn't disturb the book as much as we would think. So ideally it's a very good book. So and everything is very good. So to get into the technicalities, I mean, before getting into the technicalities of what you've written in the book, let's talk about the idea of this book and how you framed this book, because I know that you have written your primary directions book before 15 years or so, probably in 2009, if I'm not wrong. So
right.
So it's at least 13 years today. So and then you've been completely involved in a lot of academic ventures, and then you just last year you published the monumental translation of Tajika, and I think you were also simultaneously writing this book at that particular point of time. We were in touch, so I came to know that you were simultaneously writing this commercial book as well, apart from this academic work. So, uh, the question that I have for you is, it's not very easy to kind of lay a groundwork for a book. So I admire and also envy those who are able to do it very quickly. So, because I think the foundation of the book is very important even before starting the writing process. So, solar revolutions, as it is, it's not a very small thing, because astrologers have been dealing with it for as long as 2000 years. And primary directions as a technique is also as old. It's also 2000 years old. So how, I mean, there can never be an end if you start writing about revolutions and directions. So I just want to know how you finalized these are the things that are going to be in the book. And because I've been thinking of writing a book on annual predictive techniques, as I already told you. And earlier, I also remember you suggested me to wait for your book. So, uh, so now, but still, the book is really scholarly, but you also, uh, you know, spend a lot of time talking about the practical portions of revolutions and directions, which is fantastic. So I just want to ask you, like, how did you frame the book as to what it is today?
Well, it might seem as if the book was written in a fairly short time. I mean, I worked on it for something like, I don't know, a year and a half or something. But of course, when you write on a subject that you know in depth, you've really been preparing the groundwork, perhaps for decades.
Sure.
So, so it's sort of when you really know something, you can just sit down and put it on paper, so to speak, perhaps in a fairly short time. But you shouldn't forget the amount of groundwork that has gone into that. As I said, the decades of study. Now, you mentioned my Primary Directions book, which came out in 2009. So I've been working, obviously, I've kept working on primary directions since then, and I offer a course on primary directions. So I've been continuously refining that course and updating the contents and so on. And as my own practice has deepened and has changed, partly on the basis of experience and partly on the basis of conversations with others and on my reading, not least the many translations of earlier sources that other people are making available, not least Ben Dykes's translations, first from Latin sources and nowadays from Arabic sources. So those have been very helpful. So it's really a combination of many things that have gone into shaping my own practice. And the book is written, the book has sprung from that practice, from the knowledge of the techniques that I have, which I could have written about in an entirely academic manner, but also from my own personal practice, which is, is fed, you might say, by the academic study. So it's I try to present the things that I know to work, but which also have a solid foundation in the tradition. So there are many things. For instance, if you read Ben Dykes' recent translation of Abu Ma'ashar's big book, really big book on annual prediction. Sure. There are so many things in it, including quite a lot of things that I don't use. And I think you have to make a selection as a practicing astrologer. You have to make a selection of the things that you find work consistently, so that you can put your confidence in them, and also ideally techniques that hang together, that form an organic whole. And that's something I've emphasized, tried to emphasize in the book, that primary directions, profections, and revolutions, and also transits, these techniques hang together. And it's not that when you use them, that you look at the chart from 3 or 4 completely different perspectives, but rather they lock into each other, and you get more information on one technique by using another technique.
Sure. That's so it's not a book by chance, and it's also not something that's developed overnight. So it's and you also mentioned in your book, I think in the introduction or preface, that the book is probably about your experience of working with all these techniques over the years. And I think that's great. And to get into the book, so as I already said, the book is divided into 2 parts. One is background and the other is practice. So background is what interests me so much, because practice is there, but there's a little bit of historical tidbits that I want to talk about, and so which was interesting. And I think you are one of the first astrologers to mention in a book that about this myth of Western astrology. And I think that is the after the introduction, it falls as the first chapter, the myth of Western astrology. And you also mentioned this in the interview that you did with Chris Brennan. So you write that it wouldn't be, I may be wrong, but please correct me if I misquote you. So it might not be entirely correct to say something or to generalize something as Western astrology, because all these traditions, just because they're coming from the west of Indian subcontinent, it necessarily does not mean the Western world. So because the areas connecting today's Middle East, which is Lebanon, Syria and all those places, a lot of Middle East countries, they're all not West, and probably Egypt is also not West. So
no, it all depends on your perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, it depends on.
But my yes. my point was that usually, in everyday conversation, when we speak about the Western world, people pretty much know that we mean Europe, perhaps not even all of Europe, especially Western Europe and North America, and perhaps South America, but let's say the Americas and Europe, or parts of Europe, and then some former colonies like Australia and New Zealand. They are culturally part of the West, although they're actually in the South. But
they're just almost falling out of the world. So,
but there is this sort of generally accepted, if not exactly defined, idea about what Western means. Western civilization. I mean, when people who speak about Western civilization typically do not mean Egypt. They do not mean Persia.
Yeah.
They, so it's a bit of a misnomer, and I'm sure that most people don't do this, out of malice or out of any intention to deceive, but it's sort of it creates a sort of illusion that there is this thing called Western astrology, and then there's the other thing, which we won't write about. You know, I've seen so many histories of astrology where in the introduction or in the preface, the author says something along the lines of, well, of course, there's also astrology in India, but this book is about Western astrology. And then they write about Egypt, and they write about Mesopotamia, and they write about Persia. And it's what it boils down to is people can't read Sanskrit. Usually, I mean, which is it's a fact of academic training in the Western world. People outside India typically, very, very few people outside India actually know how to read Sanskrit. Sure. So they can't read Sanskrit sources. They can read, if they're well trained, they can read Greek sources, they can read Latin sources. Some of them can read Arabic sources, but very, very few people read Sanskrit. So it's just left out, which creates a very lopsided view of the actual history of astrology, which did include India very much.
Yeah, and you give two kind of a table or something, calling Western astrology and Eastern astrology, and Western
it's a
astrology
bit provocative then.
So maybe we should provoke. So so it's ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Greco-Roman world, Sasanian Persia, Arabic-speaking world, medieval and Renaissance Europe, modern Western culture, and on the right, Eastern astrology, India in brackets not included. So which basically is not part of this book as it is. But I'm sure this notion of Western astrology is, as you said, it's not it's not intended to kind of condescend other forms of astrology.
No,
that is sure. Yeah, that's not the case. But probably due to some of the historical reasons or texts that we have today, any form of astrology that was practiced outside the Indian subcontinent or adjacent but west of Indian subcontinent is called as is included in the Western astrological traditions. Probably could be one of the reasons could be because the travelers from Greece and the Mediterranean European regions probably reached Egypt and amalgamated with the then Egyptian culture, and astrology probably developed there, and it was already existing in Babylon and Mesopotamia and all those places. But because the Greeks and the Macedonians were pretty much heavy in terms of conquest, and they carried a lot of Western ideologies of ancient Greek philosophers. The historians have probably termed all these forms of astrology as Western astrology because most of medieval astrology is also influenced by some of the Greek scholars. I mean, the Greek philosophies, especially Aristotle. So, do you think it is a reasonably fair argument to make to reason out that why these forms of astrology are termed or stereotyped as Western astrology?
Well, I'm not sure how to.
No, I don't think there can be a final conclusive basis for this because I think research is ongoing, and it's very difficult to kind of put a full stop or have a dogmatic ideology about what is West and what is not West, because astrology is ultimately universal. And I am sitting in India in this southern part of India, somewhere near Bay of Bengal, who reads a little bit of ancient Hellenistic tradition and a little bit of medieval tradition, along with my Jyotish. And someone who is there in the USA or Europe, might be proficient in Jyotish. There are so many proficient Jyotishis in Jyotish Shastris in Europe as well. So so there probably is no dogmatic argument to this, but I just want to touch a little bit of history before we go into anything else. Nothing else. So yeah.
I think I think if we're going to look at terms, we can't exclude the people using the terms, who's what Western means depends on who's saying it and in what context, you know, the user of the language. But I think it's just, you know, when people speak about Western astrology, I don't think as a usual thing that they're making any sort of ideological statement. I think it's just sort of carelessness or sloppiness, if you will. I think it's used as a sort of just as a way of saying astrology that does not include India or China or, you know, that those further parts of Asia, and there is this strange misconception that I've come across many times among practicing astrologers, who really ought to know better, that Chinese astrology, as it's usually called, and Indian astrology are somehow, you know, more alike than Indian astrology and what they call Western astrology. Whereas, of course, in actual fact, what is known as Chinese astrology in the West is not at all horoscopic astrology. There has been horoscopic astrology in China and in the Chinese cultural area, but that was an import chiefly from Persia, as far as I understand, and it wasn't a major, didn't have a major impact on Chinese culture and so on, because China had its own and still has its own divinatory systems.
Tradition.
Yes, which has nothing to do with horoscopic astrology, whereas what you have in India as Jyotish is really is horoscopic astrology, and this it's really one tradition with the so-called Western astrology. So this use of the term Western astrology tends to create, as I said, an illusion that anything that we call Western astrology is, well, it's more or less the same as what we do. You know, it's with some minor discrepancies. It's, you know, it's like what you read in a modern Western astrology book, and it's, of course, that's completely wrong, because the real, as I also state in the book, the real line of demarcation is not between geographic regions, but it's a historical line. It's around the year 1900. That's when we get modern Western astrology, introduced by Alan Leo and his fellow astrologers, and they really changed astrology. They simplified it technically to an extreme degree, but even more importantly, they really changed the underlying view of astrology, what astrology is, what it's meant to do, what it's there for. And that opened the door to, he mixed it with theosophy, which was his ruling passion. And then that opened the door to depth psychology, especially Jungian psychology. So that was a really major change. And that sort of modern psychological astrology has very little to do with something that you say, something like William Lilly's Christian astrology in the 17th century. If you read that, that is much closer to Varaha Mihira than it is to Alan Leo.
Sure, yes, That's right. Whatever you said is right. So, as we already discussed, there probably is no conclusive uh, definition of what is Western astrology. So, moving on, I think we have spent enough time talking about.
Probably.
So, yeah. So, Ptolemy's predictive package. It's one of the chapters in the book, which probably laid the book for me in terms of the foundation and what you're going to talk about in the book in the upcoming chapters. So
I'm glad to hear that, because that was exactly the idea.
oh, okay, great. So it's at least I read it probably. So so the some of the things that really struck me there is like you talked about how some of the uh, mid, early medieval or probably even late medieval astrologers quoted Ptolemy, but probably some of those works are not necessarily Ptolemy. It is Dorothean, but the idea is like Dorotheus' work was lost in Greek language, and whatever we have today is in Arabic. So the late Hellenistic astrologers in transmission, uh, they actually misquoted Ptolemy, but some of those works are actually Dorotheus. Is this idea correct of what I have perceived?
Well, it's not exactly that they misquoted, but they sort of they just mixed it in.
Oh, okay.
Because this is something that I'm sure you will recognize as well from an Indian context, that if you talk to someone who is traditionally a traditional scholar, and you're historically trained, as I am, for instance,
okay,
and very much into separating sources, so if I come to a traditional Pandit in India and I say, I have this question, let's make it an example that's nothing to do with astrology. Let's say I have this question on the philosophy of Shankara. And I show him a passage from a text, say Shankara's commentary on the Upanishads, on the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I say, this is what Shankara says. What did he mean by that? Then very likely this Pandit is likely to say, well, you see, this is what Vidyaranya says, and he or someone else. And he brings in an author who lived perhaps 700 years later than Shankara, because there is this feeling, this sense that the truth is one, and all these authorities who write about this topic, they mean the same thing, or they have realized the same sort of truth or whatever, and they're just phrasing it in different ways. So from that point of view, in the medieval period, if a Greek scholar quoted Dorotheus and he wanted to make some point clear, he wouldn't think it strange at all to bring in a quotation from a completely different author like Ptolemy in order to explain Dorotheus. So it's more like that. Now, we have some fragments of the actual Greek work of Dorotheus, which was written in verse, just like so many Sanskrit works are written in verse. But what we have much more of is prose summaries of various parts of Dorotheus' work. So people who try to summarize what he's saying, and that's where we get bits of Ptolemy and other authors mixed in. And sometimes it's really difficult to separate them again and say, well, this word is Ptolemy, and that word is Dorotheus. So it's difficult.
That's great. So, so yeah. As I said, this book kind of lays the foundation of the book. So, do you just want to talk about the content of this chapter and what this chapter offers in a very brief manner, so that we can move on to the excerpt column?
Right. Okay. So that chapter lays out what I call Ptolemy's predictive package, which is exactly the sort of hierarchy of techniques that I alluded to a little while ago. Ptolemy has this hierarchy. It actually begins with something that I don't use in the book. I don't use it in my practice either. I mentioned in the book, it's these 7 ages of man, which is a sort of natural planetary period system where everyone starts out with the moon and then Mercury and then Venus and so on. Yeah. So it's a very universal system. But where it gets personal is with the primary directions. So that's his main personalized predictive technique, if you want. And so that's the most important level. And he calls these the planets that are activated by primary directions, he calls universal time rulers or chronocrators. And then the next step after that are the annual time rulers. So the ones that are only active for a year. And then there are monthly and daily time rulers as well. So it's like a Dasha Bhukti Antara system. Ish.
Yeah, of course.
And then transits on top of that. So Ptolemy had this hierarchy, and it's a hierarchy because he says the primary directions are the strongest. They decide what is going to happen. They have the final word, but the effects that are shown by the primary directions can be accelerated or delayed or modified by the next level and the next level. What Ptolemy doesn't have is the annual revolution, the solar return chart, but others had that, and it was soon incorporated into his system. So the medieval synthesis is a combination of Ptolemy's hierarchy with solar revolutions thrown in. That is the solar return chart thrown in. Sure. And using those techniques together, that's the package that I then try to demonstrate in the second half of the book, how actually to do that.
Okay. So I think that pretty much summarizes the entire chapter. And
okay, good.
So I'll just share the screen so we can just run through
right.
the experts, so you can just talk about what. So this is the publicly available excerpt from the book,
right.
which is the chapter 8 on judging the revolution figure or the solar return chart.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So this is just the initial pages of that chapter, but it might be useful as an example. So maybe we could increase the size a little more, make it easier to see the chart. So this is actually an example that was this was the last example from the previous chapter. So this is chapter 8. This was the last example discussed in chapter 7. So I'm returning to it here in chapter 8 to discuss it from another angle. This is the solar return chart, the revolution chart. In the foregoing chapter, I discussed it from the point of view of the nativity, and we looked at the directions and profections. And now I'm bringing the actual revolution chart into the discussion. And the let me just try to recap the important points here. This is, let me see.
Okay.
Where is it?
Okay.
This is page, what page is this of the book?
It's 102, 102.
102. Okay. So I'll just look at that on my own screen as well while I'm talking.
Okay.
And yeah, sorry.
No problem.
Okay, so there it is. So there's in the nativity, this is a Scorpio rising chart, and can we bring up the can you bring up the revolution chart there again? Right. Okay. So in the nativity, Scorpio is rising with Venus conjunct the ascendant, and Venus is now back at the end of Scorpio on its more or less conjunct its natal position.
Okay.
So in this example, the ascendant, yes, the primary direction of the ascendant had reached the terms of Venus in Sagittarius. So this person was in his late teens. As I recall the example, yes. It's a bit, no, sorry, this is from his mid-20s. It's a bit
no problem.
Strange looking at it from two angles simultaneously. I should have had some time to prepare this. Half a minute.
No problem.
Okay. Okay, so this is at age 24. And what we have is the directed ascendant going through the terms of Venus in Sagittarius. That means it's somewhere between 12 and 16 degrees of Sagittarius. This is a primary direction. This is not shown in the revolution chart. We just have to mentally project it onto the chart.
No problem.
But that means that Venus is an important time ruler at this time. So this is on the level of primary directions, or what Ptolemy calls the universal time rulers, universal chronocrators. Okay, so Venus is important for that reason. Now, if we look at Venus in the revolution chart, we see that it's more or less conjunct the midheaven. So it's a very powerfully placed Venus. It's very angular. It's also conjunct natal Venus, which we don't see here, but the nativity was given a few pages earlier in the book. So a planet returning to its natal position will reinforce its significations in the nativity. In the nativity, because Scorpio is rising in the nativity, Venus is ruler of the 7th house. So it's the ruler of the 7th house in the 1st house. And it's, as I said, it's returned to its natal position. And also, because the native was 24 years old, by annual profection, where you move the ascendant or any point 1 sign per year, the ascendant has returned to Scorpio.
Sure.
In this year. So Mars rules Scorpio, that makes Mars ruler of the year. But it also means that the profected ascendant is, again, conjunct natal Venus. So Venus is actually activated very powerfully in this year, but it gives its results through, at least partly through Mars, because Mars is ruler of the year. Okay?
Yeah.
So we have these 2 planets as major time rulers. These 2 are the most activated planets. And Venus, as I already said, is ruler of the 7th house, which has to do with relationships, among other things. It's naturally a significator of love and love relationships and that sort of thing. Mars, of course, is a very different sort of planet. And it is one signification of Mars that is not often mentioned in modern astrology books, but which is very prominent in earlier books, is that Mars is to do with journeys, with traveling. Of course, in historical times, travel was not something generally that you did for pleasure.
Sure.
It was arduous, it was dangerous, it was very much a Mars thing.
Yeah.
Also Mars is, for astronomical reasons, Mars is associated with travel because Mars moves in a very erratic fashion across the sky. In the revolution, we see Mars in the 9th house, which is a house of travel. And it is conjunct the Sun. The Sun is applying to a conjunction with Mars. And the Sun is the ruler of the 9th house in the nativity. So the rulerships of the nativity tend to influence the way planets work, even in the revolution. So we have Mars, which is a natural significator of journeys. It is in the 9th house of journeys. It's also conjunct the Sun, which is the
natal 9th house ruler.
9th house ruler. So we have this theme of journeys emphasized in several ways. And to make a long story short, the main theme of this year for this native was that he went abroad. He was traveling. Out of 12 months of the year, he was traveling for 8, quite far away from his place of residence, his natal place. And he also, incidentally, he was at one point, he was attacked and harmed. So this is a Mars signification, of course.
Sure.
And Mars rules his natal ascendant, so that's to do with the body. But the main theme, or the main thing to come out of this year of travel was that he met a girl or a young woman.
And bringing in Venus, sure.
Yes. So this led to a relationship that lasted, I think, some 6 years. So the final outcome of the year, you might say, was very much a Venus theme, but it came about through Mars. So he met her in his travels.
That's great.
So that is an instance of how you can combine the
directions and perfections with
directions and
revolutions.
perfections, and also the revolution chart. What we don't have in this instance is I said that the primary direction of the ascendant was in the terms of Venus in Sagittarius, so in the middle of Sagittarius. In this case, we do not have a planet there. We do not even have a planet aspecting into those terms. But that is something you quite often find. And in such a case, that will have an effect too. So if we had, for instance, had Saturn placed in the revolution chart in the terms of Venus in Sagittarius, then that would have added a Saturn dimension to the year. Happily, that wasn't the case, but there are a number of examples in the book of that facet of the technique as well.
Sure. So that's great to listen from you. And I think the final chapter is critical times and periods within a year. So after Ptolemy's predictive package, you talk about the solar return, and then primary directions in annual prediction, and then perfections and ruler of the year. And then you talk about judging the revolution figure. So initially you talk about the basic idea of solar return, and then you come back in the second part to talk about the technical practice of how to work with the solar revolutions chart in tandem with primary directions and annual perfections. So
and because you sprung this on me rather suddenly, I realized that what I just talked about was not perhaps the most pedagogical example, but and it might have been a bit confusing to people who watch this. But what I try to do in the book is actually to be pedagogical. So as you mentioned, in the practical part of the book, part 2, I first have a chapter where I introduce primary directions. Then there is a chapter where I introduce perfections. Then there is a chapter where I introduce working with a solar return chart. And the idea is to let these techniques build on each other. So by the time you get to chapter 8, and this was chapter 8, the last but one chapter of the book, things are reasonably complex, as they are in life. Of course, if you want to use astrology actually to predict things that are going to happen in real life, then by necessity it's going to be a bit complex, because life is complex. But by the time you get to chapter 8, if you actually get the book and you read the whole book, you will be prepared for it. You will have been led step by step into it, instead of being sort of hurled into the midst of these alien and confusing techniques. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that it's actually structured in such a way that you're given one piece at a time and shown, I hope, at least that's been my ambition, shown how to integrate them as you go along.
That's right. And the example was also not very difficult. It was a reasonably straightforward example. So Scorpio rising nativity, and we had to deal with Mars and Venus in the solar revolutions. So the travel theme, Mars rules journeys and Venus rules relationships, and the sun rules the 9th house in the nativity, which also deals with travel. So Sun and Mars very close to each other in the revolution figure. So there is a travel, but there is also a discomfort. At the end of the day, relationship theme also blossoms, and Venus shines from there. So I think it's a reasonably simple example. I hope I just gave a good summary of it. So
yeah, you did, absolutely. And and I think one thing that I also emphasize when discussing how to read revolution chart is that various types of repetitions is something to look out for. So you have a repetition, for instance, in Venus returning to its natal position. You have a repetition of the fact that Venus is a natural significator of love, and it also rules the 7th house, which is relationships. And similarly with Mars, you have various types of repetitions confirming that this is something to do with journeys. So when you see something repeated a number of times, you can be a little more confident with each repetition that this is going to be a prominent theme.
During that year, sure.
Yes.
Sure. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. So I surely recommend people to check out your website, in turn buy the book if someone is serious about solar revolutions and other related timing techniques. I think I mean, not everyone recommends your book on primary directions. So I also joined them. So
thank you.
So I hope, not I hope, but I'm sure if anyone buys this book, it will be of great use in terms of practical framework of using all these techniques, because we have Ben Dykes' translation of Abu Mashar, so which is a huge book, and there is a lot of things. So if you're unable to decide what you want to do from that book, this book probably gets you started. So yeah,
I mean, this is meant as a sort of extract or essence of the writings of what I found most useful in the writings of Abu Mashar, of Sahl, of Ptolemy, for that matter, and so on. So I wouldn't. I mean, I definitely recommend everyone to read the old authors, absolutely. But as you say, it can be a bit daunting, and sometimes you want more practical examples. I've tried to make this, as you mentioned just before we went online today. You mentioned that this is a more practical book than my primary directions one. That is, it has more examples. And I wanted to make it more practical, and I thought that was necessary, because this is the topic of this book is so complex in that it combines different techniques.
Sure. And yeah, so I don't think anyone should probably wait to order the books. So just go ahead, and thanks, Martin, for joining again.
Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. I'm sure we'll be back again with something else.
Probably.
Bye.
Goodbye.